Sarah Martinez had always been the quiet girl who sat in the back corner of her chemistry class. At 17, she preferred books to parties and spent most weekends helping her mother tend their small garden behind their modest house in suburban Denver. Her father, Sergeant Miguel Martinez, had been deployed to Afghanistan for 8 months, and the family had settled into a routine of video calls every Tuesday and Friday evening. The call came on a rainy Thursday in October. Sarah was reviewing for her SATs when her mother's scream pierced through the house like a blade. She found her mother collapsed on the kitchen floor, the phone still pressed against her ear, sobbing words that Sarah couldn't understand. The voice on the other end was calm and professional, explaining that Sergeant Martinez had been critically injured in an IED explosion while on patrol outside Kabul. The next few weeks passed in a blur of hospital visits, insurance calls, and sleepless nights. Sarah watched her mother transform from a confident woman who managed the household finances and coached Little League softball into someone who could barely remember to eat. The bills started piling up on the kitchen counter. Their health insurance covered most of the medical expenses, but the frequent trips to Walter Reed Medical Center in Maryland drained their savings account faster than water through a broken dam. Sarah found herself stepping into roles she had never imagined. She learned to balance the family checkbook, negotiate payment plans with creditors, and research her father's veterans' benefits. While her classmates worried about homecoming dances and college applications, Sarah spent her evenings on hold with insurance companies and reading medical reports she didn't fully understand. Her father survived, but the man who eventually came home was not the same person who had left. The explosion had damaged his spine, leaving him partially paralyzed from the waist down. More challenging than his physical injuries were the invisible wounds. He startled at sudden noises, avoided crowded places, and often stared out the window for hours without speaking. The family's small house, which had once felt cozy, now felt cramped and tense. Sarah's grades began to slip. Her longtime friend Jessica noticed first, pointing out that Sarah had missed 3 student council meetings in a row. When Jessica asked what was wrong, Sarah found herself unable to explain. How could she tell her friends that she was helping her father with basic tasks like getting dressed, and that their family might lose their house because of mounting medical bills? How could she describe the sound her father made when he woke up screaming from nightmares? The guidance counselor, Mrs. Henderson, called Sarah into her office in November. She had noticed the drop in Sarah's academic performance and wanted to discuss college preparation. Sarah sat in the uncomfortable plastic chair and tried to focus as Mrs. Henderson talked about application deadlines and scholarship opportunities. The words seemed to float around her like soap bubbles, pretty and meaningless. When Mrs. Henderson asked about her plans for the spring semester, Sarah realized she hadn't thought about her future in months. She had been so focused on managing the present crisis that the idea of leaving for college seemed impossible. Who would help her mother navigate the Veterans Administration paperwork? Who would drive her father to his physical therapy appointments? Who would make sure the bills got paid on time? Her chemistry teacher, Mr. Peterson, noticed that Sarah was falling asleep in class. He had always considered her one of his most promising students, someone who might pursue a career in medicine or research. When he approached her after class to ask if everything was all right at home, Sarah simply nodded and mumbled something about staying up late studying. She couldn't bring herself to explain that she had been awake until 3 in the morning researching wheelchair accessibility modifications for their house. The transformation in Sarah was subtle but profound. She developed a hyper-vigilance that made her constantly aware of her surroundings. She learned to read people's moods quickly and adjust her behavior accordingly. She became an expert at appearing normal, while inside she felt like she was constantly holding her breath, waiting for the next crisis to hit. Her relationship with her friends began to change. They still invited her to movies and shopping trips, but Sarah found herself making excuses more often than not. She felt guilty spending money on entertainment when her family was struggling financially. More than that, she felt disconnected from their concerns. When her friends complained about getting grounded for missing curfew or stressed about upcoming tests, their problems seemed trivial compared to what her family was facing. At home, Sarah became the emotional caretaker for both her parents. She learned to recognize the warning signs of her father's panic attacks and developed strategies to help him calm down. She became skilled at redirecting conversation when her mother started crying about their financial situation. She discovered that humor could sometimes break the tension that hung over their house like a thick fog. The holidays approached with a mixture of dread and forced cheerfulness. Their extended family didn't know how to act around her father's disability, and their usual traditions felt impossible to maintain. Sarah found herself planning a scaled-down celebration that would accommodate her father's limitations while trying to preserve some sense of normalcy for her younger brother, who was struggling with his own confusion about their father's condition. School became a refuge where Sarah could pretend to be a normal teenager, but it also became a place where she felt increasingly isolated. Her teachers saw a student whose grades were declining and who seemed distracted, but they didn't see the weight of responsibility she carried or the way she had been forced to grow up practically overnight. They didn't notice that she was developing skills in crisis management, medical advocacy, and financial planning that most adults never learn. Sarah's world had fundamentally shifted, but to the outside observer, she was still just a high school senior who needed to focus more on her studies. The gap between her internal reality and external expectations grew wider each day, creating a loneliness that felt impossible to bridge. The winter brought new challenges that tested Sarah's growing resilience in ways she never anticipated. Her father's physical therapy sessions were scheduled 3 times a week, and the nearest VA facility was a 40-minute drive from their home. Since her mother had started working double shifts at the local diner to help cover their expenses, the responsibility of transportation fell to Sarah. She had gotten her driver's license just 6 months before her father's injury, and now she found herself navigating busy highways and hospital parking garages with a confidence that surprised even her. During these drives, Sarah and her father began to develop a new kind of relationship. Away from the suffocating atmosphere of their house and the well-meaning but awkward attempts at conversation from family friends, they found they could talk more easily. Her father started sharing stories about his fellow soldiers, not the heroic tales he used to tell at barbecues, but real stories about fear, friendship, and the strange humor that develops in impossible situations. Sarah learned that her father had been writing letters to the families of soldiers who hadn't made it home. He dictated them to her during their drives, and she helped him find the right words to express condolences and share memories. These conversations taught her about a depth of human experience that none of her textbooks had ever mentioned. She began to understand that strength wasn't about being invulnerable, but about continuing to care for others even when you were broken yourself. At school, Sarah's appearance began to change in ways that reflected her internal transformation. She stopped wearing makeup and styled her hair in simple ponytails that took seconds rather than the elaborate styles she had once spent 20 minutes perfecting each morning. Her clothes became more practical, focused on comfort and functionality rather than fashion. Some of her classmates interpreted this as depression or giving up, but Sarah knew it was actually a form of clarity about what truly mattered. Her English teacher, Ms. Rodriguez, assigned a personal narrative essay in January. While her classmates wrote about summer vacations and sports victories, Sarah found herself writing about the sound of her father's wheelchair in the hallway and the way her mother's hand shook when she paid bills. Ms. Rodriguez was struck by the maturity and emotional depth of Sarah's writing, but when she tried to discuss it privately with Sarah, the girl deflected the conversation back to technical aspects of the assignment. The social dynamics of high school began to feel increasingly surreal to Sarah. She watched her classmates organize elaborate promposals and stress about who was dating whom, and she felt like an anthropologist observing a foreign culture. The concerns that had once seemed important to her now felt like elaborate games played by people who had never encountered real consequences. This wasn't superiority she felt, but rather a profound sense of displacement, as if she were seeing everything through glass. Sarah's younger brother, David, was 13 and struggling to understand why their family had changed so dramatically. He had always looked up to Sarah, but now he seemed almost afraid of her. She had become serious and responsible in ways that felt unnatural for a teenage sister. When he brought friends over, Sarah found herself automatically checking to make sure they weren't being too loud, that they picked up after themselves, and that they understood her father needed quiet space. She realized she was parenting her brother in ways their mother no longer had energy for. The financial pressure on the family continued to mount, despite her mother's extra work hours. Sarah discovered that her father's disability payments wouldn't begin for several months due to bureaucratic delays. and their savings had been depleted by travel expenses and medical costs not covered by insurance. She started researching part-time jobs she could manage around her school schedule and her father's appointments. The guidance counselor's earlier conversations about college seemed to belong to a different lifetime. Sarah's relationship with her best friend Jessica reached a breaking point in February. Jessica had been patient about Sarah's frequent cancellations and distracted behavior, but when Sarah missed Jessica's 18th birthday party without explanation, Jessica confronted her in the school parking lot. The argument that followed revealed how far apart their worlds had grown. Jessica accused Sarah of thinking she was better than everyone else, of using her family situation as an excuse to avoid responsibilities to her friends. Sarah tried to explain, but found herself unable to articulate the crushing weight of her daily reality without sounding like she was asking for pity. The confrontation with Jessica forced Sarah to recognize how isolated she had become. She hadn't deliberately pushed her friends away, but her life had taken on rhythms and priorities that were incompatible with typical teenage social life. She was operating on adult timelines and dealing with adult consequences, while her peers were still protected by parents who handled the serious business of life. The gap felt unbridgeable. In her AP history class, they were studying World War II and the concept of total war, where entire societies were mobilized for conflict. Sarah found the term resonating with her personal experience. Her father's war hadn't ended when he came home. It had simply shifted location. Their entire family was now engaged in a different kind of battle, one fought in hospital waiting rooms and insurance offices rather than on foreign battlefields. But unlike the historical examples they studied in class, their war was invisible to the outside world. Sarah began keeping a journal, something she had never done before. Writing became a way to process experiences that seemed too complex for normal conversation. She wrote about the guilt she felt when she enjoyed something simple, like a good grade on a test, while her father struggled with basic mobility. She wrote about the anger that sometimes bubbled up when she saw her classmates complaining about problems that seemed trivial. She wrote about the strange pride she felt in her growing competence at handling adult responsibilities, mixed with grief for the carefree teenager she had been just months before. The journal also became a place where Sarah began to articulate a growing awareness that her education was happening as much outside the classroom as inside it. She was learning about healthcare systems, veterans' benefits, family dynamics under stress, and personal resilience. She was developing skills in advocacy, negotiation, and crisis management. But none of this learning was recognized or valued by her school's systems of evaluation and advancement. Spring brought both relief and new complications to the Martinez family. The weather warmed enough for Sarah's father to spend time on their small back porch, and some of his darker moods seemed to lift slightly with the longer days. However, the approach of graduation season created new pressures that Sarah hadn't anticipated. College acceptance letters were arriving for her classmates, and the constant conversations about future plans made Sarah's uncertainty feel more acute than ever. Sarah had submitted college applications back in the fall, before their world had changed, but she hadn't given serious thought to how she could actually attend. The financial aid packages that arrived were generous, but still required family contributions they couldn't afford. More troubling was the realization that leaving home would mean abandoning her family when they needed her most. The independence she had once eagerly anticipated now felt like a betrayal of the people who depended on her. Her mother had noticed Sarah's college dilemma but felt powerless to help. During one of their rare quiet moments together while folding laundry, she apologized to Sarah for the burden their situation had placed on her shoulders. Sarah responded that she didn't mind helping, which was both true and false. She didn't resent her family for needing her, but she grieved for the choices that had been taken away from her. The conversation ended with both women in tears, though neither could fully articulate why. At school, Sarah's teachers were preparing their students for final exams and graduation. Mr. Peterson approached her about a summer research program at the local university that he thought would be perfect for her. The opportunity would have thrilled her a year ago, but now Sarah could only think about the hours it would take away from her family responsibilities. When she explained that she couldn't commit to the program, Mr. Peterson seemed confused by her lack of enthusiasm for an opportunity that could enhance her college applications. The disconnect between her teacher's expectations and her reality became more pronounced as the semester progressed. In her AP literature class, they read stories about coming of age and self-discovery that felt absurdly irrelevant to her experience. While the characters in their assigned books struggled with identity and independence in abstract ways, Sarah was dealing with concrete responsibilities that had reshaped her identity whether she wanted them to or not. Sarah's role as her father's advocate had expanded beyond transportation to include attending medical appointments and asking questions her parents were too overwhelmed to think of. She had learned to navigate the VA bureaucracy with a persistence that impressed even the social workers. During one particularly frustrating phone call about delayed benefit payments, a VA representative complimented Sarah on her organized approach and suggested she consider a career in healthcare administration. The irony wasn't lost on her that she was receiving career advice while helping her father fight for benefits he had earned through his service. The transformation in Sarah's relationship with authority figures had been gradual but significant. She had learned to advocate firmly but respectfully with doctors who rushed through appointments, insurance representatives who denied claims, and bureaucrats who seemed indifferent to her family's situation. These skills served her well when dealing with school administrators, though her teachers sometimes misinterpreted her directness as defiance rather than competence. Sarah's brother David had begun acting out at school, and Sarah found herself attending parent-teacher conferences alongside her mother. David's teachers described behavioral problems that Sarah recognized as symptoms of the stress their family was under, but the school's response focused on punishment rather than support. Sarah tried to explain their family situation to David's counselor, but found herself struggling to make adults understand the ripple effects of her father's injury on everyone in their household. The prom season arrived with its familiar rituals of dress shopping and dinner planning. Sarah's friends had assumed she would participate, but the cost of a dress and dinner felt impossible given their family's financial constraints. More than that, the idea of spending an evening focused on frivolous celebration while her father struggled with depression seemed wrong to her. When she declined to go, her friends interpreted it as another example of her growing distance from them. Sarah had started working part-time at a local grocery store, taking evening shifts after her father's appointments and on weekends. The work was mundane but provided much-needed income and gave her a sense of contributing to their family's stability. Her co-workers were mostly adults dealing with their own financial pressures, and Sarah found their conversations about rent payments and childcare more relatable than her classmates' discussions about college social life. The job also gave Sarah perspective on the economic realities that many families faced even without the trauma of war injuries. She worked alongside single mothers taking second jobs to pay for their children's school supplies and older adults who couldn't afford to retire. These encounters broadened her understanding of how many people lived with constant financial stress, and she began to see her family's situation as part of a larger pattern of economic vulnerability that was largely invisible to her more privileged classmates. As graduation approached, Sarah faced increasing pressure from her guidance counselor to make decisions about college enrollment. Mrs. Henderson couldn't understand why Sarah was hesitating to accept admission to schools that had offered her substantial financial aid. During their final meeting, Sarah tried to explain her family situation more fully, but Mrs. Henderson's response focused on not letting circumstances derail her academic potential. The counselor seemed unable to grasp that Sarah's circumstances had become an integral part of who she was, not an obstacle to overcome. Sarah's teachers began writing recommendation letters that praised her academic abilities, but missed the profound personal growth she had experienced. They wrote about her potential for success in college, but didn't mention her demonstrated ability to handle complex adult responsibilities. They described her as a student who had lost focus during her senior year, rather than recognizing that her focus had shifted to areas outside their awareness or expertise. The award ceremony in May highlighted how completely Sarah's transformation had gone unnoticed by her school. She watched classmates receive recognition for leadership, community service, and overcoming challenges, while her own growth and contributions remained invisible. The irony was that Sarah had developed more real-world leadership skills and had made more meaningful contributions to her community than many of the students being honored. But these achievements didn't fit into the categories the school recognized or valued. The final weeks before graduation brought a strange mixture of endings and beginnings that Sarah navigated with the same quiet competence she had developed for everything else in her life. While her classmates organized senior pranks and planned graduation parties, Sarah was researching accessibility modifications for their house and helping her father apply for vocational rehabilitation programs. The contrast between her priorities and those of her peers had become so stark that she sometimes felt like she was living in a parallel universe. Sarah's decision about college crystallized during a family meeting in late May. Her parents had insisted on discussing her future despite their own overwhelming challenges. Her father, speaking more clearly than he had in months, told her that he didn't want his injury to derail her education. Her mother had researched student loans and work-study programs, trying to find ways to make college financially feasible. But as they talked through the logistics, it became clear that Sarah's presence at home wasn't just helpful, but necessary for their family's functioning. The conversation revealed how much Sarah had become the bridge between her parents and the complex systems they needed to navigate. She translated medical terminology from her father's treatment team, organized paperwork for insurance claims, and coordinated schedules that involved multiple healthcare providers. Her organizational skills and ability to communicate effectively with professionals had become essential to their family's ability to access the support they needed. Sarah made the decision to defer college enrollment for a year, though she knew in her heart it might be longer. She would continue working at the grocery store and take community college classes part-time, while remaining available for her family's needs. When she informed her guidance counselor of this decision, Mrs. Henderson's disappointment was palpable. The counselor warned Sarah about the statistics showing that students who delayed college were less likely to complete their degrees, as if Sarah hadn't already calculated the risks and benefits of her choice. Her teachers' reactions to her decision revealed how little they understood about her transformation over the past year. Mr. Peterson expressed concern that she was wasting her scientific aptitude, not recognizing that she had developed research and problem-solving skills through navigating healthcare and benefit systems that rivaled anything she might learn in a freshman chemistry lab. Ms. Rodriguez worried about Sarah losing her intellectual edge, unaware that Sarah's journal writing had developed her analytical abilities in ways that went far beyond traditional academic exercises. The graduation ceremony itself felt surreal to Sarah. She sat with her class wearing the same cap and gown as students who had spent the year worrying about test scores and social drama. But her experience of senior year had been fundamentally different. When her name was called and she walked across the stage, Sarah was acutely aware that she was receiving recognition for an educational experience that had only partially captured her actual learning and growth. Her family attended the ceremony, her father managing the crowded auditorium despite his anxiety about large groups of people. Sarah's mother had taken the day off from work, and David had worn his only dress shirt for the occasion. Seeing them, in the audience, Sarah felt a complex mixture of pride and sadness. She was proud to be the first person in her family to graduate from high school with college acceptances, but she was also aware of how much their support had cost them and how uncertain their future remained. After graduation, Sarah's former classmates scattered to summer jobs, family vacations, and college orientation programs. Social media filled with photos of beach trips and dorm room shopping that highlighted how different Sarah's summer would be. She felt no envy, exactly, but rather a wistful curiosity about the path she wasn't taking. Sometimes she wondered who she might have become if her father hadn't been injured, but those thoughts felt pointless and disloyal. Sarah's work schedule expanded to full-time during the summer, and she discovered that she enjoyed the rhythm and responsibility of regular employment. Her supervisor noticed her reliability and attention to detail, offering her additional training in customer service and inventory management. These skills felt more immediately useful than many of the subjects she had studied in school, and Sarah began to appreciate learning that had direct, practical applications. The community college classes she enrolled in for the fall were a compromise between her desire for continued education and her family responsibilities. She chose courses that met in the evening or on weekends, and selected subjects that might enhance her ability to help her family navigate their ongoing challenges. A psychology course helped her understand trauma responses, while a business class taught her about healthcare economics and insurance systems. Sarah's relationship with her high school friends continued to evolve as they began their college experiences. Jessica had enrolled at a state university 3 hours away, and their text conversations revealed how quickly their lives were diverging. Jessica's complaints about roommate conflicts and difficult professors seemed to come from a different world than Sarah's daily reality of medical appointments and bill paying. Sarah found herself editing her responses carefully, sharing only the most neutral details about her life to avoid creating uncomfortable conversations. The gap between Sarah's experience and that of her former classmates became most apparent during holiday breaks, when college students returned home. At a coffee shop in December, Sarah ran into several friends who were home for winter break. They were full of stories about fraternity parties, challenging professors, and new relationships. When they asked about Sarah's plans, she mentioned her community college courses and job, but could see in their expressions that they viewed her choices as somehow lesser than their own experiences. What her friends couldn't see was how much Sarah had grown in ways that didn't fit traditional measures of development. She had learned to advocate effectively in professional settings, to manage complex schedules and competing priorities, and to provide emotional support while maintaining her own stability. She had developed a practical understanding of healthcare, veteran services, and family finances that would serve her throughout her life. Most importantly, she had discovered reserves of strength and resilience that she never knew she possessed. Sarah's father had begun participating in a support group for veterans with combat injuries, and through this connection, Sarah met other military families dealing with similar challenges. She realized that her experience, while feeling isolated and unique at her high school, was actually shared by many young people whose lives had been reshaped by their parents' military service. These conversations helped her understand that her transformation was part of a larger pattern of young people taking on adult responsibilities due to circumstances beyond their control. The support group also connected Sarah with older veterans who had successfully navigated the transition from military to civilian life, despite significant injuries. Their stories gave her hope about her father's long-term recovery and helped her understand that the skills she was developing as a caregiver and advocate would be valuable throughout her life, regardless of what career path she eventually chose. 2 years after graduation, Sarah had settled into a routine that would have been unimaginable to her teenage self. She was enrolled in her 4th semester at the community college, working toward an associate degree in social work with a focus on veteran services. Her course load was light enough to accommodate her work schedule and family responsibilities, but rigorous enough to keep her intellectually engaged. The professors at the community college seemed to better understand students who balanced education with real-world obligations. Sarah's job at the grocery store had evolved into a supervisory position that came with better pay and benefits. Her manager had recognized her natural leadership abilities and enrolled her in a company training program for potential store managers. The work wasn't glamorous, but it provided stable income and healthcare coverage that her family desperately needed. More importantly, it had taught her about business operations, employee management, and customer service skills that were transferable to any career. Her father's condition had stabilized, though his recovery was far from complete. The nightmares came less frequently, and he had developed coping strategies for managing his anxiety in crowded spaces. He had started volunteering at the VA hospital, using his own experience to help other veterans navigate the transition to civilian life. Sarah often drove him to these volunteer sessions, and she took pride in seeing him find purpose in helping others despite his own ongoing struggles. The family's financial situation had improved gradually. Her father's disability benefits had finally been approved after a lengthy appeals process that Sarah had helped coordinate. Her mother had been promoted to assistant manager at the diner, and the combination of steady incomes had allowed them to catch up on bills and even start a small emergency fund. The house modifications they had needed for her father's wheelchair had been partially covered by veterans' benefits, though Sarah had organized fundraisers through their church to cover the remaining costs. David, now 15, had adjusted better to their family's new normal than anyone had expected. He had joined the wrestling team at school, finding an outlet for the anger and confusion he had felt during the first year after their father's injury. Sarah made sure to attend his matches whenever possible, understanding how important it was for him to have family support. Their relationship had evolved from the typical sibling dynamic to something more collaborative, with David taking on household responsibilities that matched his age and abilities. Sarah's social circle had changed completely since high school. She had little in common with her former classmates, whose college experiences had taken them in directions that felt foreign to her. Instead, she had formed friendships with co-workers, fellow community college students, and other military family members she had met through her father's support groups. These relationships were based on shared understanding of adult responsibilities, rather than shared memories of adolescent experiences. One of Sarah's closest friendships was with Maria, a woman 10 years older, who was also studying social work while raising 2 children as a single mother. Maria had served in the Army herself and understood both the challenges of military life and the demands of balancing education with family obligations. Their study sessions often took place in hospital waiting rooms or break rooms, and they helped each other navigate the practical challenges of being non-traditional students. Sarah's academic performance in community college was excellent, partly because her coursework directly related to challenges she was already managing in her daily life. Her papers on trauma-informed care drew from her experience supporting her father's recovery. Her research on veterans' benefit systems was informed by months of navigating bureaucracy on her family's behalf. Her professors recognized the depth of practical knowledge she brought to theoretical discussions, and several had encouraged her to consider pursuing a bachelor's degree. The question of transferring to a 4-year university had become more feasible as Sarah's family situation stabilized. Her father's volunteer work gave him a sense of purpose that made him less dependent on her constant support. Her mother had developed confidence in managing their finances and medical appointments. David was old enough to take on more responsibility around the house. For the first time since her father's injury, Sarah could envision a future where she might be able to leave home for her own education. Sarah had researched transfer programs at the state university that would allow her to complete a bachelor's degree in social work with a specialization in veterans services. The program offered evening and weekend classes designed for working adults, and the tuition was reasonable with the transfer credits she had earned. She had even identified potential part-time jobs near the university that would allow her to maintain some income while studying. However, the decision to transfer was complicated by factors that had nothing to do with academics or finances. Sarah had become deeply embedded in her local community through her advocacy work with military families. She served on the board of a non-profit organization that helped veterans access benefits and had developed expertise that was valuable to families facing situations similar to her own. Leaving would mean abandoning work that felt meaningful and important. Sarah's relationship with her former high school had remained non-existent since graduation. She occasionally heard news about former teachers through social media or chance encounters, but she felt no connection to the institution that had failed to recognize or support her transformation during her senior year. When Mrs. Henderson reached out to invite her to speak at a career day about non-traditional paths after high school, Sarah politely declined. She felt no anger toward her former counselor, but also no obligation to help the school understand experiences they had been unwilling to acknowledge when it mattered. The invitation did prompt Sarah to reflect on how completely her life had diverged from the path that had once seemed inevitable. Her former classmates were finishing their junior years at various colleges, preparing for internships and study abroad programs that represented the kind of traditional college experience Sarah had once expected to have. She felt no regret about the choices she had made, but she sometimes wondered about the person she might have become if circumstances had been different. Sarah's journal writing had continued throughout the past 2 years, evolving from a way to process trauma and stress to a method for setting goals and tracking her personal growth. She wrote about her plans for transfer to the university, her career goals in veterans services, and her hopes for her family's continued healing. She also wrote about the unexpected gifts that had emerged from their crisis, including the strength she had discovered within herself and the depth of connection she had developed with her family. The most significant change in Sarah's perspective was her understanding of success and achievement. Her high school had measured success through test scores, college acceptances, and academic awards that now seemed narrow and inadequate. Sarah had learned that real achievement often looked like showing up consistently for people who needed support, advocating persistently through bureaucratic obstacles, and maintaining hope in the face of uncertain outcomes. These lessons weren't captured in any transcript, but they had prepared her for life in ways that traditional education alone could never have accomplished. 3 years after high school graduation, Sarah stood at another crossroads that would have been unimaginable to her 17-year-old self. She had been accepted to the State University's bachelor's program in social work, with most of her community college credits transferring smoothly. The financial aid package was manageable, and she had arranged to keep her grocery store job on a part-time basis. Everything seemed aligned for her to take this next step, yet she found herself hesitating for reasons that surprised even her. The hesitation wasn't about leaving her family, though that remained a consideration. Her father had made remarkable progress in his recovery, finding stability through his volunteer work and a new medication regimen that better managed his symptoms. He had even started talking about pursuing job training through the VA's vocational rehabilitation program. Her mother had been promoted again and was managing the family's finances with competence that had grown from necessity into genuine skill. David was thriving as a junior in high school, and their relationship had evolved into one of mutual respect and support. Instead, Sarah's uncertainty stemmed from a growing awareness that her path through life was fundamentally different from the traditional timeline that the university system assumed. She had developed skills, knowledge, and perspectives through her unconventional journey that were valuable and shouldn't be dismissed in favor of starting over as a typical college junior. She wanted to continue her education, but she also wanted recognition for the learning that had already taken place outside of classrooms. Sarah's work with the Veterans Nonprofit had expanded her role to include training other advocates and speaking at conferences about family member perspectives on military mental health. Her presentations drew standing ovations not because she was an inspirational speaker, but because she offered practical insights based on lived experience that professional audiences rarely heard. She had co-authored a resource guide for military families that was being distributed by the VA nationwide. These accomplishments felt more significant than any grade she had ever received. The decision became clearer when Sarah was offered a full-time position with a regional veterans service organization that would allow her to develop programs specifically for military family members. The salary was competitive with what she might expect to earn after completing her bachelor's degree, and the work aligned perfectly with her passion and expertise. More importantly, the position offered opportunities for professional development and advancement that didn't require traditional educational credentials. Sarah accepted the job offer but continued taking classes part-time in the evenings. This arrangement allowed her to pursue her educational goals while building a career based on her unique qualifications. Her professors at the community college had become mentors who understood her non-traditional path and helped her design a learning plan that complemented her professional responsibilities. She was essentially creating her own interdisciplinary degree program that combined formal education with experiential learning. The irony wasn't lost on Sarah that she was now earning more money and having greater impact in her field than many of her former classmates who had followed traditional paths. Jessica had graduated with a degree in communications, but was working as a server while searching for entry-level marketing positions. Other classmates were struggling with student loan debt that exceeded their starting salaries. Sarah's practical approach to education and career development had positioned her better than the conventional wisdom suggested was possible. Sarah's expertise had brought her to the attention of policymakers working on veterans issues. She was invited to testify before a state legislative committee about gaps in support services for military families. Her testimony, based on personal experience rather than academic research, provided lawmakers with insights they hadn't previously considered. The committee chair commented afterward that Sarah's presentation had been more informative than most expert witnesses they typically heard from. The speaking engagement led to additional opportunities to influence policy at both state and federal levels. Sarah found herself traveling to Washington, D.C. to meet with congressional staff members about proposed legislation affecting veterans' benefits. Her unique perspective as both a family member and a professional advocate gave her credibility with lawmakers who were tired of hearing from lobbyists with only theoretical knowledge of the issues. These professional achievements brought Sarah recognition that her high school never could have imagined or facilitated. She was featured in a magazine article about young advocates making a difference in veteran services. A national veterans organization honored her with an award for innovative programming. Most meaningfully, she received letters from military families across the country who had been helped by resources she had developed. Sarah's relationship with her former high school remained non-existent, but she had begun speaking at other schools about non-traditional paths to success. Her presentations focused on the skills that young people could develop through volunteer work, family responsibilities, and part-time employment that were just as valuable as traditional academic achievements. She encouraged students to see challenges as opportunities for growth rather than obstacles to overcome. During one school visit, a guidance counselor asked Sarah what her former school could have done differently to support her during her senior year. Sarah's response was thoughtful and specific. The school could have recognized that students dealing with family crises were developing valuable life skills that deserved academic credit. They could have offered flexible scheduling that accommodated students with significant home responsibilities. Most importantly, they could have expanded their definition of student success to include emotional intelligence, advocacy skills, and practical problem-solving abilities. Sarah's romantic life had also developed in ways that reflected her transformed priorities and values. She had begun dating Marcus, a veteran who worked in peer counseling at the VA hospital where her father volunteered. Their relationship was built on shared understanding of military culture and commitment to service rather than the superficial attractions that had characterized her high school relationships. Marcus appreciated Sarah's maturity and competence, while she valued his dedication to helping other veterans heal from their experiences. The relationship with Marcus also highlighted how much Sarah's perspective on partnership had evolved. She wasn't looking for someone to complete her or provide for her, but rather for a companion who shared her values and could contribute to their mutual goals. Their conversations were about building careers that mattered, supporting their families, and finding ways to make a positive impact in their community. These were adult concerns that required adult approaches to problem-solving and decision-making. Sarah's journal writing during this period reflected a sense of integration and purpose that had been absent during her high school years. She wrote about feeling aligned with her values in ways that traditional success metrics had never captured. Her work felt meaningful because it emerged directly from her personal experience. Her education was relevant because she chose courses that enhanced her ability to help others. Her relationships were authentic because they were based on who she actually was rather than who she thought she should be. The transformation that had begun with her father's injury was complete, but Sarah understood that growth and change would continue throughout her life. She had learned to see challenges as opportunities for development, rather than threats to her plans. She had discovered that strength came not from avoiding difficulties, but from facing them with creativity, persistence, and support from others who understood the journey. 5 years after her father's injury, Sarah Martinez stood before a congressional subcommittee as the lead witness in a hearing on military family support services. At 23, she had become one of the most respected advocates in the veterans community. Her expertise sought by policymakers, researchers, and service organizations across the country. The scared 17-year-old who had once struggled to navigate insurance claims had evolved into a confident professional whose voice carried weight in the highest levels of government. The hearing room was packed with military families, veterans advocates, and congressional staff members. Sarah's testimony drew from both her personal experience and the systematic research she had conducted through her organization. She spoke about the gaps in support that left families like hers to navigate complex systems without guidance, and she presented specific policy recommendations based on successful programs she had helped develop. Her presentation was professional and compelling, but what made it powerful was the authenticity that came from lived experience. After the hearing, several representatives approached Sarah to discuss her recommendations in greater detail. She found herself explaining complex policy implications with the same confidence she had once brought to arguing with insurance companies about her father's claims. The skills were the same, but the stakes had expanded, far beyond her own family's welfare to encompass thousands of military families facing similar challenges. Sarah's professional success had created opportunities for her family that extended beyond their individual recovery. Her father had been hired as a peer counselor at the regional VA facility, his own experience with injury and recovery making him uniquely qualified to help other veterans. The salary wasn't large, but the work gave him purpose and allowed him to contribute financially to the household for the first time since his injury. More importantly, it had completed his transformation from victim of circumstance to agent of change for others. Her mother had used the management skills she had developed during their family crisis to advance in her career. She was now the general manager of a small restaurant chain, overseeing multiple locations and supervising dozens of employees. The confidence she had gained from successfully managing their family's complex needs during the worst period had translated into professional competence that her employers valued. She often told Sarah that the crisis had taught her capabilities she never knew she possessed. David had graduated from high school with academic honors and a wrestling scholarship to a state university. His experience of watching Sarah balance education with responsibility had influenced his own approach to college planning. He chose to major in physical therapy with a focus on working with veterans, inspired by his father's recovery process and his sister's advocacy work. The family trauma that could have derailed his adolescence had instead given him purpose and direction. Sarah's relationship with Marcus had deepened into a partnership that reflected their shared commitment to service and family. They had married in a small ceremony at the VA hospital chapel, surrounded by veterans and family members who understood the significance of their union. Their relationship was built on mutual respect for each other's work and shared understanding of the challenges faced by military families. They were planning to buy a house near both the VA facility and Sarah's organization, creating a home base for their continued advocacy work. The couple had also begun talking about starting their own family, with conversations that reflected Sarah's transformed understanding of what it meant to prepare for parenthood. She didn't worry about having the perfect nursery or the ideal timing, but rather about creating a stable foundation of purpose and values that could withstand unexpected challenges. Her experience had taught her that children needed parents who could adapt to circumstances while maintaining their commitment to each other and their community. Sarah's educational journey had continued in unconventional ways that reflected her integrated approach to learning and career development. She had completed her bachelor's degree through a combination of community college courses, professional development programs, and independent study projects that earned academic credit. Her thesis project was a comprehensive evaluation of family support programs that was published in a social work journal and cited by other researchers. The degree had enhanced her credibility, but it was the knowledge and skills she had developed through experience that made her work effective. The question of graduate school had become more complex as Sarah's career advanced. Several universities had approached her about pursuing a master's degree in social work or public policy, offering flexible programs that would accommodate her professional responsibilities. However, Sarah had also been offered opportunities to influence policy and practice at levels that typically required advanced degrees. She was considering whether formal education would enhance her impact or whether her energy was better invested in direct advocacy work. Sarah's former high school had finally reached out to invite her to speak at their graduation ceremony, 6 years after they had failed to recognize her transformation during her senior year. The invitation letter praised her achievements and described her as an inspiration to current students. Sarah's initial reaction was to decline, but after discussing it with her family, she decided to accept. She saw it as an opportunity to speak directly to students who might be facing their own invisible challenges. Her graduation speech focused on the theme that real education happens everywhere, not just in classrooms. She talked about the skills that could be developed through family responsibilities, volunteer work, and part-time employment. She encouraged students to see setbacks and challenges as opportunities for growth rather than failures to overcome. Most importantly, she urged them to define success for themselves rather than accepting narrow definitions imposed by others. The response to Sarah's speech was overwhelmingly positive, with several students approaching her afterward to discuss their own family situations and non-traditional goals. Teachers who remembered her as a struggling senior expressed amazement at her transformation, though Sarah gently pointed out that the seeds of her current success had been present during high school, in ways they hadn't recognized. The speech planted seeds for changes in how the school approached student support and success. Measurement. Sarah's work had expanded beyond direct service to include research and training that influenced the broader field of military family support. She had co-authored a training manual for social workers that was being used in graduate programs across the country. Her organization had received federal funding to replicate their family support model in other regions. She was frequently invited to speak at professional conferences where her presentations combined personal narrative with policy analysis in ways that audiences found both compelling and instructive. The recognition Sarah had received for her work felt meaningful, in ways that high school awards never could have. She had been honored by organizations whose missions aligned with her values, and the recognition was based on measurable impact rather than potential promise. More importantly, the letters and emails she received from families who had been helped by her work provided daily reminders that her career was making a real difference in people's lives. As Sarah reflected on her journey, from scared teenager to respected advocate, she understood that her father's injury had been a catalyst for growth that might not have occurred otherwise. The trauma had forced her to develop capabilities she never knew she possessed, and had connected her with a sense of purpose that gave meaning to even the most difficult days. While she wouldn't wish their experience on anyone, she could honestly say that it had led her to a life that felt authentic and impactful in ways that her original plans never could have achieved. The war had indeed transformed her, and though her school had refused to notice, the broader world had eventually recognized the value of her unique journey and the expertise that had emerged from it.